afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Concord Bookshop. We're delighted to have Pulitzer Prize-winning author Geraldine Brooks with us this fine Sunday afternoon. Thank you all for coming out. We appreciate your being here. Geraldine has been a correspondent to the Wall Street Journal in Bosnia, Somalia, and the Middle East. Her nonfiction book, 9 Parts of Desire, right here, was based on her experience with Muslim women in the Middle East and has been translated into 17 languages. Geraldine has also written 3 novels. Her first, Year of Wonders, is about a young woman's battle to survive the plague. The second, March, won the Pulitzer in 2006 and is a retelling of Little Women from the father's point of view. It's Mr. March. Her latest, People of the Book, is another wonderful work of historical fiction, this time about the creation and survival of a rare medieval illuminated Hebrew manuscript, a book that actually exists to this day. As we travel through the book, we meet the various people responsible first for the book's creation and then for its survival against all odds. This is a fascinating book full of both suspense and historical knowledge. It's been expertly woven together, and without further ado, is Geraldine Brooks.
Hi there, it's wonderful to be back in Concord and on such a pretty day. I'm happy to see that that groundhog was all wet the other day. I'd like to start by taking you back with me, if I can, to an experience that I think probably everybody in this room shares with me. And that is the encounter with the very first book that ever captivated you and carried you away. And for me, that book was The Valley of Adventure by the English children's author Enid Blyton. And I was 9 years old when I encountered it. And it was the book that turned me from the class goody-goody into somebody who is in a lot of hot water for reading under her desk when she was supposed to be learning the rivers of New South Wales. Anyway, when I finished that book, I was thrilled to see that it was one in a series of 7 that Enid Blyton had written, and I couldn't wait to get my hands on them. But sadly, the local library didn't have any other books in the series, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. When the book God smiled on me, and in the children's pages of the Sunday paper, in the classified section where kids sold things to each other, the entire series of 7 adventure books was listed for sale. So we didn't have an abundance of money when I was growing up, and the modest asking price for these books seemed like a fortune to me, so I was a bit reluctant to broach it with my parents. But I finally got up the nerve, and when I did, I learned something about my family that I hadn't known until then, which was that for my parents, books were in a special class of thing, like food, that you somehow found the money for. So they bought me these books, and the day they arrived, I was beside myself, and I lined them up on the dining room table, and I couldn't breathe, and I was flushed, and my heart was beating fast, and it wasn't an unpleasant feeling exactly, but it was one I'd never had before, and I didn't have a name for it. So I was 9 years old then, and it would be 6 years before I had that feeling again, in a very different context. And by then I knew the word for it, and that word was lust. But I think the fact that I felt my first stirrings of physical desire for a bunch of used books might have been predictive of my career path, and maybe even predictive that I would be drawn to write People of the Book, which is a book about a book, and about the people who make books, and who love books, and who conserve them, and protect them, and sometimes even give their lives for them. You have the first slide. So I'm sorry to tell you that this is a picture of a library, and it's the National Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina, seen here in flames during the earliest days of the siege of the city of Sarajevo. And when those flames were extinguished, this was all that was left of the library. Can we have the next one? And that was what I saw when I arrived in Sarajevo as a newspaper reporter. My job in those days was covering the United Nations for the Wall Street Journal. So I was in the city to write about what the UN was and was not doing at that time. And can we have the next slide? It was very hard days in Sarajevo. There's only one functioning hotel, and this is it. This is rather inaptly named in the circumstances Holiday Inn. And as you can see from that slide, when you checked into the Holiday Inn, you didn't want to be asking for a room with a view, because if you could see the beautiful mountains that rise like a bowl encircling the city, then the snipers and the artillerymen on the mountains could see you. And that could be lethal. And they shelled the Holiday Inn quite a bit, and one night they shelled it. A colleague of mine, a BBC reporter named Kate Adie, was staying there. And Kate is a formidable person at any time, but when she hasn't had a good night's sleep, she's really somebody to be reckoned with. So she got up in the morning absolutely furious and demanded to cross the front line, and she went and confronted the Serbian artillery commander and said, "Why are you shelling the Holiday Inn? You know that only foreign civilian journalists are staying there." And he took a couple of steps backwards and said, "Yes, ma'am, I do know that, and you have my profound apology. Last night we weren't aiming at the Holiday Inn, we were aiming at the building across the road." Well, the building across the road was the Bosnian National Museum. It was a brutal war, even by the harsh yardstick that measures any war, because it was a war against civilians. But it was also a war against an idea that this particular group of civilians embodied. And that was the idea that people of difference, Christians, Muslims, Jews, could live together, not just in tolerance, that's always seemed to me a kind of a wishy-washy word, but in a real spirit of mutual celebration and intellectual exchange. And that was the story of Sarajevo for centuries. And that idea was anathema to the ethnic cleansing ultra-nationalists who believe only one kind of person is good enough. So if you need to make war on an idea like that, you have to kill the people that embody it, but you also have to destroy the record that such a civilization ever flourished. And that's why you target libraries and the Bosnian National Museum, which this is before it was shelled. It doesn't actually lean like that, but it took a tremendous amount of fire during the war. So how does all that turn into an idea for a novel? Next slide. If you get one question as a novelist, it's where do you get the ideas for your books? And I've always loved Ernest Hemingway's answer to that question. Hemingway said an idea for a novel can be something that you're lucky enough to overhear, or it can be the wreck of your whole damn life. Luckily for me, it's so far been the former rather than the latter. But I think that Hemingway would be pleased that the idea for people of the book was something that I overheard in a bar in a war zone. He'd probably approve of that. And what I heard was that this treasure of the Bosnian Museum Library, this 600-year-old illuminated Haggadah, was missing. And nobody knew its fate. And there are all kinds of rumors flying around. Journalists love rumors. So there are all kinds of theories, and people held to them as if they had impeccable sources, that the Muslim government had sold the book on the black market to buy weapons, that Mossad had sent a team through a tunnel under Sarajevo airport to take it to safety in Israel. And I listened to all this and I filed it away thinking I must check into that, but way leads on to way in journalism, and I never wrote the story. And it was almost 3 years later, when the Sarajevo Haggadah was produced at the Passover celebration of the city's Jewish community, that the true story of this book was revealed. And the true story was that a Muslim librarian named Enver Imamovich had risked his life in the first days of the shelling of the city and gone to the museum and cracked a safe and brought the book to a safe hiding place. And when this was revealed, it was also revealed that this wasn't the first time that this Hebrew book had been saved by Muslim hands. That a very similar rescue had been enacted during World War II by a Muslim librarian named Dervish Korkut, who had saved the book from looting by no less than a Nazi general who had come demanding that it be turned over for a particular project of the Führer's, which was to be called the Museum of the Lost Race. And this macabre idea was that after all the Jews of Europe had been killed, there'd be a little Jewish Disneyland, and buildings had been safeguarded from sacking in the Jewish quarter of Prague, and they were to house the looted treasures of Judaica from all over Europe. And a particularly ghastly detail was that Czech actors were to be hired to dress up as Hasidic Jews and walk the streets outside so that the tourists of the Thousand-Year Reich could have a look at this civilization that no longer existed. Well, Dervish Korkut did his part to thwart that plan by taking the Sarajevo Haggadah and sticking it down the waistband of his trousers and pulling his suit coat over it and going and telling the general Fortner, I'm so sorry, I thought you knew. One of your officers came to the museum only a few days ago and demanded the book, and of course I gave it to him. And the general was beside himself, and he said, "Who was this? Name the man." And Korkut said, "Sir, I didn't think it was my place to demand the name of an officer of the Reich." Then he took the book home and had lunch with his wife, and they discussed what to do with it, and they decided that the safest place to hide it would be in a mosque. So the Sarajevo Haggadah spent its years during World War II tucked away amid Korans in a little rural mosque up in the mountains. So once I heard that, I was hooked. I love a story where you can know something but you can't know everything. I like to follow the line of fact as far as it leads. But you also need the facts to run out at some point. You need voids for imagination to work, for the novelistic enterprise of creative empathy to kind of try and bring the people of the past back to life. So this was a perfect story for me, because when you go back before World War II, the facts start, the line of fact, the thread of fact starts to fray very quickly. The book came to public notice in the 1890s when an indigent Jewish boy brought it to his Hebrew teacher and said, "We haven't got any money in our family, do you think anyone would buy this old book?" And the teacher instantly recognized that it was something quite remarkable. Before that, we know it was in Venice in 1609 because at that time it was rescued by a Catholic priest. Otherwise it would have been sent to the fires of the Pope's Inquisition, along with many other Hebrew and Islamic texts. And we know it was created in Spain, but how it got out of Spain, who carried it, who made it, none of those things do we know. And we also don't know this. We don't know why it was illuminated at the time when Jewish teaching was strongly against figurative art because of the commandment, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or likeness of anything." And yet here's this book full of likenesses of all kinds of wonderful things. The top miniature here, a Haggadah, I'm sure you all know, is the book that Jews use at home at the Passover meal to tell the story of the exodus of the Hebrew slaves from Pharaoh's Egypt. And so here you see the story of Moses, the baby being tucked into the basket and set adrift on the River Nile and finding his way to Pharaoh's daughter. Interestingly, though, the River Nile appears to be flowing past a town that looks just like medieval Barcelona. The next one. And here's Moses grown up with his staff, come to confront Pharaoh. "Let my people go," he says. And Pharaoh's looking pretty much like a Spanish medieval prince. And Pharaoh, of course, rejects the request, and the plagues come, and we see the plague of frogs here. And the frogs are jumping into Pharaoh's palace out of the Spanish medieval bread oven. So it's this fantastic combination of familiar biblical story with wonderful detail of Spanish medieval life that makes this book so richly rewarding for study. I'll just show you a couple more illuminations that raise some interesting questions to me about who the artist was. This is part of an earlier sequence that briefly tells the Genesis story, and preceding these paintings are paintings showing the division of light and dark and earth from water. And here you see the plants being created, and then the animals, and then Adam and Eve. But all this is happening on an earth depicted as round. And the prospective date for this work is about 1450. So in 1450 that was still a pretty radical idea. It wasn't widely accepted. So who was the artist who already knew that? And then this last little image on the page, yeah, if you're going to break the rules, let's go whole hog here, because here we have the figure on the bench resting, would be God himself. So making images of God is really out there. So the mystery of the Illuminator is one of those voids where I could let my imagination work, and those of you who've read the book know I let it go hog wild. Can we have the next one? So I knew that I wanted to write about the people of the book, the creators and the protectors through time. But this left me with a dilemma, because how do you tie together stories that span 600 years and half a dozen different cultures? And I really didn't have a clue, and I was sort of working blind. And I was at the point where I really wanted to see more than a facsimile of the Sarajevo Haggadah, but I didn't know if that was going to be possible, because the book had been locked away for decades, and even very serious scholars hadn't been allowed anywhere near it, much less would-be novelists. So I was delighted when I heard that the UN was funding conservation work on the manuscript. And because I'd been a UN correspondent, I knew a lot of people there. And boy, were they sorry they knew me. Because I nagged them and I pleaded with them and I badgered them, and finally they said, oh, all right, you can go and observe the work. So I was in the room with Andrea Pataki while she worked on the manuscript. And as I was watching her, I not only got to see the book up close, but I got to see what a book conservator does. And I had no idea until then what a fantastic profession it is, and what an incredible diversity of skills that it requires. Because you have to be a scientist who understands the molecular structure of old parchments, and an artist enough to understand the intention of the artist whose work you are trying to preserve. You also have to be an incredible craftsman who can stitch and tool leather and make paper and do a whole raft of skilled things. But you also have to be a detective, and that was the thing that surprised me the most, because when Andrea Pataki found any little bit of matter trapped in the binding, she would get very excited and she would pluck it carefully out and she would label it, and she would send it away to be chemically analyzed, because she explained to me that if you find a crumb of food or a quill pairing, that can give you a wealth of information about the provenance of a manuscript. And so in the evenings, after the book was locked away, we would sit over dinner and she would tell me some stories about things that had been extracted from books. And that was what gave me the idea for the structure of the novel, that I would have a conservator in the near present who would find traces of insect wing and a white hair and the wine stains, and each of these things would take the reader on a journey back in time to meet the people of the book. Yes. So there's the Haggadah today, back on display in the Bosnian National Museum in a lovely room that the UN funded. And it has pride of place, but in the niches around the walls are displayed related manuscripts from the different communities that make up Sarajevo. So there are Islamic texts and Christian books of ours. And the idea is to show the common roots from which all these cultures have drawn nourishment over the years. And today this little book bears this really heavy weight as a symbol of the survival of the multi-ethnic ideal of Sarajevo, and the triumph of the idea that we can live together, and that those who say only one kind of person is good enough will always be defeated. And I'd just like to finish before we have a discussion and questions by just sharing a little bit of the creative process of turning facts into fiction with you. This is the illumination that I kept going back to and back to. And it's a depiction of a Spanish Jewish family in the Middle Ages celebrating Passover. And it's quite wonderful because it's so recognizable. What's on the table is what you'd see on the table in any Jewish home on any Passover. The matzah is there, the cups of wine, the lamb shank, the father reclining as he leads the Seder, because you recline to show that you're a free man, because slaves, of course, could not recline at meal. But who's the African woman there with the piece of matzah about to chomp on it? If you're talking about 1450, to be black in Spain was to be Moorish, which was almost certainly to be Muslim. So who's the Muslim guest at the affluent Jewish family Seder? We'll never know. So I was free to make it up. There's a lot of presumption in doing that, and I'm aware that it takes a lot of chutzpah to think yourself into lives that are so different from one's own. And I take counsel from two writers whose work I admire immensely. And I guess the permission for me comes from James Baldwin. Baldwin stuck up for William Styron when Styron had been taken to the woodshed for trying to imagine his way into the head of an African-American man in Confessions of Nat Turner. And many African-American writers took exception to that, but James Baldwin felt otherwise. And he wrote eloquently that each of us, helplessly and forever, contains the other. Male and female, white and black, black and white. We're part of each other. So I believe that, and that's what makes it possible for me to do some of the things I do. And then the other piece of advice is more along the lines of a technical issue of how do you do it. And I got my best guidance on this from a contemporary British writer called Jim Crace, who wrote a book called Quarantine that's set in biblical Israel. And I asked him what research he did for that book, and he said the most single useful thing he did was go on a camping trip in the Judean desert. And he had a Bedouin guide, and the first morning of the camping trip, the guide woke him up and said, "Mr. Jim, how did you sleep?" And he said, "Ahmed, I slept like a log." And then he said he raised his eyes to the bare, rock-ribbed hillside of the Judean desert. No logs. So he turned to his guide and said, "Ahmed, how did you sleep?" And Ahmed said, "Mr. Jim, I slept like a dead donkey." So ever since he told me that, I've always thought that the business of historical fiction is the business of turning logs into dead donkeys. And I hope when you read People of the Book, you'll find a few dead donkeys in there. And just one last thing. Much as it's wonderful these days to be able to do a lot of research online, for me there's nothing quite like showing up. Whether it's showing up in Sarajevo, one of the great moments in the research for this book was I was trying to clarify what had happened to the Haggadah during World War II, and there were conflicting accounts of what Dervish Coker had done. One said he climbed out a window and shimmied down a drain pipe, and totally contradictory. One said he never took the Haggadah out of the library at all, he just misshelved it somewhere. And I really wanted to know what he had done before I started riffing on it. And I learned that he had a niece who works for the US State Department teaching Bosnian language. So I got in touch with her, and she very kindly agreed to meet with me. And she was translating family papers and letters for me. And suddenly in the middle of one letter, she looked up and said, "You know, if you really want to know what happened during World War II, you should ask his wife." Well, I picked up my jaw, and it had never occurred to me that a man who was in his 60s, when he confronted this general, would have a living widow. And she said, "Oh, yes, Auntie was 37 years younger than Uncle." So my ticket to Sarajevo was booked and paid for before I left the Foreign Service Institute. So I think that, you know, boots on the ground is a good way to go, and boots in the library also, because you can only find online what you know that you're looking for. And it was in the stacks of Widener when I was looking for information on the Catholic priest that saved the book in Venice in 1609, that I think the ghost of that priest, about whom there is very little known except the books that have survived because they bear his signature. That ghost of that priest sort of led me into the wrong row of stacks, and I put out my hand and it landed on a thin volume that was the autobiography of a Venetian rabbi in 17th century Venice. It was as if Vistorini, the priest, was whispering to me, "You will see me through this man's eyes." Because in that autobiography was an account of going to the office of the Pope's Inquisition in Venice to plead to save Jewish books. And so I was able to bring Vistorini back to life through the eyes of the rabbi. So that's how it works. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions, comments, and abuse if necessary. So what happened in a nutshell was that I was raised Catholic in a very Baroque and traditional style in Sydney, Australia, with Irish priests and nuns and school uniforms and little gloves. And for some reason, when I was about 14 years old, I developed this passionate, intense fascination for Jewish history, to the point where I was wearing a little Star of David with my Catholic school uniform and writing perhaps the only paper in the public exam in New South Wales that dealt with the Suez crisis. And so I kind of fell out of Catholicism over feminist issues and the Vietnam War and that whole thing, and so I was cruising contentedly without religion when I fell in love with a man named Horwitz. Failing to realize that that was a Jewish name at the time. Now I see it on all those boxes of matzah, and I wonder why I was so thick about that. But anyway, when we decided to get married, there was no way that I was going to be the end of the line for a history that had survived, you know, the sack of Jerusalem by the Romans, the expulsion from Spain, the Inquisition, the pogroms in Russia, and the Shoah. So I converted to Judaism, and my son is going to be bar mitzvah this year. But I don't think everybody needs to do that. So there's the illuminations, which are apparently separate. They're in separate choirs. And then they're bound together with the text, which is done by a sofer or Hebrew scribe, and quite beautifully done. And then, you know, there's some kind of decorations that would be more typical of what you would see, where the letters are used in decorative ways. It's not printed, it's hand applied gold leaf on gesso, but there is a lot of gold leaf. I mean, whoever made this book did not stint, so the materials are very rich. There's gold and silver leaf. The ultramarine is made from ground lapis lazuli. Other semi-precious stones have been used in the pigments, so it's a very, very rich thing. Have I done a Seder out of it? Sadly, our Hebrew doesn't run to being able to do it out of a book without any transliteration. But no, actually we rely fairly heavily on the Mos Haggadah, and if you haven't seen that one, I really, if you're... This is the most exquisite modern illuminated manuscript, and the facsimiles, they're not so cheap, but the amount of thought that's gone into it is really remarkable.
Done?
The conservation, such as it was done in a bank in Sarajevo with about 10 guards looking over this poor woman's shoulder with their radios crackling, and they were Sarajevo police and Danish UN peacekeepers and bank guards and museum guards, everybody keeping an eye on everybody else, because there was still a lot of tension in the city at that time. But now that things are quieting down, I hope that more and more extensive scholarship will be done. What Andrea Pataki was trying to do was get the book in a condition where it could be safely put on exhibition, but she didn't have a chance to do some of the in-depth scholarship that would reveal a lot more about. So it opens and it closes. It's very unpredictable. When I was there, the Haggadah wasn't on exhibit because a piece of the roof had fallen in. I mean, the building was extensively damaged, and they haven't really had the money to address that with all the other needs in the city. And the last time I was there, there was no heat in the whole place, which is not so good for exhibits either, and really hard on the museum director, who was huddled in her coat in a little sort of closet because her big, gorgeous office was uninhabitable. You could, your breath would turn to icicles. So it's still very tough in the city.
Percolating?
Yes, something is percolating, or dripping, or doing something. It's very close to home, actually. It wasn't something that I overheard this time. It was something that my eye fell on. I was looking at a map of Martha's Vineyard, where we live now, and it was a particular map that shows Wampanoag sites of interest. And on it was an annotation saying, birthplace of Caleb Cheshat-Tiamak, first Native American graduate of Harvard. And I thought, oh, how cool. Maybe I can go down and talk to him about what that was like. I was thinking 1974. 1665. So that got me to thinking. And what I started thinking about, well, it had always kind of intrigued me, who were the English who it wasn't inconvenient enough to be in Massachusetts in 1641. They had to put 7 miles of pretty treacherous current between them and the mainland. And so thinking about them and actually finding out that they were in flight from the Taliban, aka the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were kind of liberal Puritans, if that's not an oxymoron. And so they arrived. There's several dozen of them and 3,000 Wampanoags on the island. And what was that like? So it's called Caleb's Crossing. Yeah, but before that I have to hasten to add that I like my mother, and I don't jump into bed with people I've just met.
No, I didn't ask you that.
She's by no means me. She has an Australian voice, which is the voice in my head, and that's then the fun of being a novelist, is to make up a life that's the opposite of your own. So I didn't prepare myself. I was sitting at home happily in my house in Sydney, Australia, having just done a story for the Wall Street Journal about how flatulent sheep in New Zealand were really useful tools for exploring global warming. And I got a call from the foreign editor. And when I found out who was on the phone, I thought, oh, crikey, I'm going to get sacked for putting too many tasteless fighting sheep jokes in there. And she was calling to offer me the Middle East correspondence job. And a lot of reporters spend their whole life dreaming about being a foreign correspondent and being a war correspondent. That was not my intention. I thought maybe restaurant reviewer would be nice. But once they offered me that job, there was no way to turn it down. I just said yes straight away, and then I had to turn around and convince my husband that moving to Cairo was a great idea, even though he didn't have a job there. But no, I didn't prepare myself, and I wasn't prepared for it, and you never know how you're going to react to it. And it's the craziest thing in the world, but I found I was very suited to it. And I can't tell why that was, but, the crazier it got, the calmer I got.
Well, what about when you wrote 9 Points of Desire? That was many years ago.
It was
Different
many
time.
years
What was
ago.
that like?
So, that grew out of the 6 years that I covered the Middle East full-time specifically. So that was the distillation of my own journey to try and understand what the hell was going on all around me with young women of my own generation readopting the veil that their mothers in many cases had chosen to throw off. So I was trying to understand that, and it led me to the way that I was able to finally do that job for the Wall Street Journal effectively, which was by trying to hear the voices of the women of the region that had been so ignored, and through that it just led to, it was a much more socially acceptable way for a woman to go about reporting. So when I went to Iran, I ended up having tea with Mrs. Khomeini, and when I went to Jordan, I would be eating veggie burgers with Queen Noor, and you know, it was an unusual perspective from which to see the Middle East at that time. And so at the end of it, I realized that I'd had all these experiences, and I wanted to try and distill it, because I thought it would be useful for people to see how women in the Middle East in very different circumstances navigated their lives. And I had no idea that this would become such an important topic of conversation. There are others that have survived. There are a number of really remarkable and beautiful illuminated Haggadah, including the Golden Haggadah in the British Museum. And there's one very like this one in, it's incomplete, but it is in the Theological Seminary in New York City. And I reckon it's the same illustrator, although nobody else thinks so. And what happened with the Sarajevo Haggadah in the 1890s was when it came to light, it caused art historians to look again. And when you look with the right question, you find the right answer. So they found that there actually was a tradition of Jewish figurative art. It was just that it had been overlooked, or the manuscripts had been misdated because of the assumptions that had been made. It's very similar, actually. It's much less different than I would have expected. I went through it with my rabbi, and she said, you know, everything's in there that you would expect to find. And I've been to Sephardic Seders in Iran where they're quite different, and there's one wonderful moment where you turn around and hit each other over the head with leeks, which I've tried to incorporate into our Seder, but it hasn't caught on. That's not in the Sarajevo Haggadah. It's very close to, you know, the story of the fort with sons. And
Four-type children?
yeah, all that's there. All that's there, yeah.
It strikes me that you always use a historical fact as foundation for your novels.
I always do use a historical fact.
And then you can build around it.
Yeah, I really love that whole process of finding the incomplete story. And maybe it's because I'm too lazy to make the whole thing up. But for me it's great to have that scaffolding of fact and that narrative arc that's already in place, and to work within it.
Have you ever thought of doing a joint project with your husband?
Well, we used to work together a lot when we were journalists.
On the same article?
On the same articles. So when we were foreign correspondents, it often would be that we'd cover a conflict from opposite sides, which was very interesting, but not great for the marriage. We'd have to communicate through the foreign desk in some cases. I'd be in Tunis and he'd be in Jerusalem, and then there weren't even any phone. And it was pre-internet. I can't believe it. I feel like such a dinosaur when I say that. The first time I ever saw the internet was down in university in the Negev desert. Israeli scientists were talking to Arab colleagues on this blue screen of type. And I thought, ooh, that could be big. Unfortunately, I didn't follow through and invest. But no, he says I've gone to the dark side now. He doesn't believe in making stuff up, so he goes and does his thing, and I do my thing. But we're working on things that are of great mutual interest at the moment. He's writing about John Brown's Raid, so he's meeting all my old favorites from around here, the Secret Six. Yeah, we've dragged each other into our respective interests. The Civil War, ho-hum, I thought. And I knew he was interested in it, but it wasn't until we moved to Virginia, where we lived for a decade, that I learned the saying, the Civil War was fought in 10,000 places. And I learned that he intended to take me to every single one. So, yeah, but I finally found a way I could connect with it, which was through this idea of what happens to idealists when they go to war. And I've dragged him. He says he would have happily lived his entire life without leaving the east coast of the United States. And look what happened to him. So, the question is, when have I had climbed the scaffolding and fallen off it? It happened with a story that's very dear to my heart in Australia. But I think part of the problem was there was too much. There wasn't enough room for imagination, because the woman that I was most interested in had kept a journal every day of her life where she noted down not only her feelings but also the price she paid, for a bag of nuts. So there was nothing for me as a novelist to do. Well, if there are no more questions, I look forward to meeting you and signing any books that you